Question 1. Performance analysis shows that a long-standing client of Banorte wishes to make a significant international transfer. The client is unable to provide detailed documentation for the source of all funds immediately, citing a recent inheritance that is still being processed. The Banorte employee is aware of the client's history, but also recognizes the need to comply with anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Banorte employee? Option A. Decline the transfer outright and inform the client that Banorte cannot accommodate such requests due to insufficient documentation, without further explanation. Option B. Politely explain to the client that full documentation for the source of funds is required before the transfer can be processed, and offer assistance in gathering the necessary information, or suggest alternative methods if applicable within regulatory guidelines. Option C. Immediately process the international transfer to maintain good client relations, assuming the client's long-standing relationship with Banorte implies legitimacy. Option D. Advise the client on how to structure the transfer in smaller amounts over time to avoid triggering enhanced due diligence requirements. The correct answer is B. Politely explain to the client that full documentation for the source of funds is required before the transfer can be processed, and offer assistance in gathering the necessary information, or suggest alternative methods if applicable within regulatory guidelines. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee of Banorte to navigate a situation where a client's request might inadvertently lead to a breach of regulatory requirements. The core challenge lies in balancing client service with strict adherence to financial regulations, specifically those governing customer identification and transaction monitoring. A careful judgment is required to identify potential risks without alienating the client or compromising the integrity of Banorte's compliance framework. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of Banorte's Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) policies, which are derived from Mexican financial regulations. This approach prioritizes verifying the client's identity and the source of funds before proceeding with the transaction. This is crucial because Mexican financial laws mandate robust customer due diligence to prevent financial crimes. By adhering to these established procedures, the Banorte employee upholds regulatory compliance, protects Banorte from potential penalties, and maintains the trust of regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach that involves immediately processing the transaction without proper verification fails to meet the fundamental requirements of customer due diligence mandated by Mexican financial authorities. This oversight creates a significant risk of facilitating illicit activities, leading to severe penalties for Banorte, including fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach, which is to simply refuse the transaction without attempting to understand the client's situation or explain the regulatory reasons, demonstrates poor client relationship management and a lack of proactive problem solving. While compliance is paramount, a professional should aim to educate the client on the necessary steps while still upholding regulatory standards. This approach risks losing the client and failing to identify any legitimate underlying reasons for the client's request that could be addressed within the regulatory framework. A third incorrect approach, which is to seek a workaround that bypasses established verification procedures, is highly unethical and directly contravenes regulatory intent. Such actions would constitute a deliberate attempt to circumvent compliance, exposing Banorte to extreme legal and financial repercussions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Identifying the core regulatory requirement at play, e.g., KIC AML. 2. Assessing the client's request against these requirements. 3. If a conflict arises, prioritizing regulatory compliance. 4. Communicating clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the regulatory basis for any necessary steps or limitations. 5. Seeking guidance from compliance or legal departments if the situation is complex or unclear. 6. Documenting all interactions and decisions. Question 2. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of unusual transaction activity associated with a specific client account at Banorte, which deviates from established risk profiles and could indicate potential money laundering or fraud. What is the most appropriate immediate action for the employee who identified this anomaly? Option A. Document the anomaly in a personal log but take no further immediate action, waiting to see if the pattern repeats. Option B. Attempt to resolve the transaction anomaly independently by contacting the client directly to verify the activity. Option C. Ignore the anomaly, assuming it is a system error or a minor deviation that does not warrant attention. Option D. Immediately escalate the observed anomaly to Banorte's designated compliance department or supervisor for further investigation and action. The correct answer is D. Immediately escalate the observed anomaly to Banorte's designated compliance department or supervisor for further investigation and action. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee at Banorte to interpret and act upon information from a monitoring system that may indicate potential non-compliance. The challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient operations with the stringent regulatory obligations Banorte must uphold. A misinterpretation or inaction could lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and harm to clients. Therefore, careful judgment and a thorough understanding of Banorte's internal policies and relevant Mexican financial regulations are paramount. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the identified anomaly to the designated compliance department or supervisor. This is the best professional practice because it ensures that potential regulatory breaches are handled by individuals with the expertise and authority to investigate thoroughly and take appropriate action. This aligns with the principles of robust internal controls and the duty of care expected of financial institutions under Mexican law, such as those outlined by the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, CNBV. Prompt escalation minimizes the risk of further non-compliance and allows for timely remediation, thereby protecting Banorte and its clients. An incorrect approach of ignoring the alert or attempting to resolve it independently without proper authorization or expertise is professionally unacceptable. Ignoring the alert constitutes a failure to report potential misconduct or regulatory breaches, which is a direct violation of internal control procedures and potentially Mexican financial regulations requiring vigilance against illicit activities. Attempting to resolve it independently, without the necessary knowledge or authority, could lead to the misapplication of policies, the destruction of evidence, or the exacerbation of the non-compliance issue, all of which carry severe regulatory and ethical consequences. Another incorrect approach of documenting the anomaly, but not escalating it, also fails to meet the regulatory requirement for proactive reporting and intervention. Professionals at Banorte should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct. This framework involves 1. Recognizing potential red flags or anomalies flagged by monitoring systems. 2. Consulting internal policies and procedures for guidance on handling such situations. 3. Escalating any identified concerns to the appropriate compliance or supervisory personnel without delay. 4. Cooperating fully with any subsequent investigation. This systematic approach ensures that all potential issues are addressed within the established regulatory and internal governance structures. Question 3. The assessment process reveals that a long-standing client of Banorte wishes to make a large, unusual international wire transfer. The client has provided a basic explanation for the transfer, but it lacks specific details that would typically be required for such a transaction under Banorte's standard operating procedures and Mexican financial regulations. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Banorte employee handling this request? Option A. Decline the wire transfer outright due to the lack of detailed information. Option B. Immediately process the wire transfer as requested to maintain good client relations. Option C. Advise the client to find another financial institution that can handle their request more efficiently. Option D. Request further documentation and clarification from the client regarding the purpose and source of funds for the transfer, and if necessary, consult Banorte's compliance department. The correct answer is B. Immediately process the wire transfer as requested to maintain good client relations. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an employee of Banorte to navigate a situation where a client's request might conflict with internal policies designed to protect both the client and the institution from financial crime. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client service with stringent regulatory compliance obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that, while facilitating legitimate transactions, Banorte also upholds its commitment to anti-money laundering (AML) and Know Your Customer (KIC) Principles. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the transaction against Banorte's established AML/KYC policies and relevant Mexican financial regulations. This approach is right because it prioritizes regulatory adherence and risk mitigation. Specifically, Mexican financial laws and Banorte's internal guidelines mandate that all transactions, especially those involving significant sums or unusual patterns, must be scrutinized to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. By seeking clarification and potentially escalating the request if it raises red flags, the employee demonstrates due diligence, a cornerstone of regulatory compliance in the financial sector. This aligns with the principles of responsible banking and the legal obligations of financial institutions in Mexico to report suspicious activities. An incorrect approach that involves immediately approving the transaction without further inquiry fails to meet the due diligence requirements mandated by Mexican financial regulations. This oversight could expose Banorte to significant legal and reputational risks, including fines and sanctions for noncompliance with AML/KYC laws. Another incorrect approach, which is to refuse the client outright without understanding the context or attempting to gather more information, could be seen as poor customer service and might not be in line with Banorte's client relationship policies, although it is less egregious than outright noncompliance. However, a more critical failure would be to approve the transaction while having identified clear indicators of potential illicit activity, thereby directly violating AML/KYC obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's request, then cross-references it with internal policies and external regulations. If any ambiguity or potential risk is identified, the next step is to gather more information from the client or internal subject matter experts. If the risk persists or is confirmed, escalation to a compliance department or supervisor is the appropriate course of action, ensuring that decisions are made with full awareness of regulatory requirements and institutional risk appetite. Question 4. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a long-standing client of Banorte, known for their consistent and predictable transaction patterns, has requested a significant, uncharacteristic wire transfer to an offshore entity with limited publicly available information. The client has provided a brief, general explanation for the transfer, but has not offered detailed documentation regarding the source of funds or the ultimate beneficial owner of the receiving entity. Which of the following represents the most appropriate course of action for the Banorte employee handling this request? Option A. Immediately approve the wire transfer as requested, given the client's long-standing relationship and the general explanation provided. Option B. Decline the wire transfer request outright due to the lack of detailed documentation and the unusual nature of the transaction. Option C. Inform the client that the request cannot be processed and suggest they find another financial institution that can accommodate their needs. Option D. Escalate the request to the Banorte Compliance Department for further review and investigation, and engage the client to politely request additional supporting documentation regarding the source of funds and the beneficial ownership of the receiving entity. Correct answer is A. Immediately approve the wire transfer as requested, given the client's long-standing relationship and the general explanation provided. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an employee of Banorte to navigate a situation where a client's request, while seemingly straightforward, could potentially lead to a breach of regulatory requirements concerning anti-money laundering, AML, and customer due diligence, CDD. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client service with the imperative to uphold legal and ethical obligations. A hasty or uncritical fulfillment of the request could expose Banorte to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and operational risks. Conversely, an overly rigid or uncommunicative refusal could alienate the client. Therefore, careful judgment, a thorough understanding of relevant regulations, and effective communication are paramount. The correct approach involves a proactive and compliant response. This entails recognizing the potential red flags raised by the client's request, initiating an internal review process to assess the risk, and engaging with the client in a transparent yet cautious manner to gather necessary information without compromising confidentiality or regulatory mandates. This approach aligns with the principles of robust AML/CDD frameworks, which mandate that financial institutions conduct appropriate due diligence on their customers and report suspicious activities. Specifically, It reflects the obligation to understand the source of funds and the purpose of transactions, especially when they deviate from established patterns or involve entities with limited transparency. An incorrect approach would be to immediately approve the transaction without further inquiry. This failure stems from a disregard for the established CDD and AML protocols designed to prevent financial crimes. By not performing due diligence, Banorte would be failing to meet its regulatory obligations, potentially facilitating illicit activities and exposing itself to severe sanctions. Another incorrect approach would be to refuse the request outright without attempting to understand the client's rationale or offering alternative compliance solutions. This demonstrates a lack of client relationship management and a failure to explore legitimate business needs within the bounds of regulation. While compliance is essential, a complete lack of engagement can be detrimental to client relationships and may not be the most effective way to manage risk if the client's intentions are indeed legitimate, but require further clarification. A third incorrect approach would be to delegate the decision to a junior staff member without providing adequate guidance or oversight. This represents a failure in internal control and risk management. Compliance responsibilities, particularly those related to AML/CDD, require a certain level of expertise and authority to ensure that decisions are made in accordance with regulatory expectations and the institution's risk appetite. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk-based approach. First, identify the potential regulatory or ethical implications of the client's request. Second, consult internal policies and procedures, as well as relevant regulatory guidance, to understand the specific requirements. Third, assess the risk associated with the request based on the client's profile, the nature of the transaction, and any available information. Fourth, if necessary, engage with the client to gather further information or clarify the request, always maintaining a professional and compliant demeanor. Finally, document all actions taken and decisions made, ensuring transparency and auditability. Question 5. Market research demonstrates that a significant portion of potential clients for Banorte's wealth management services express a strong preference for high-risk, short-term investment strategies, often influenced by social media trends. A prospective client approaches a Banorte advisor with a specific request to invest a substantial portion of their savings in a highly speculative cryptocurrency fund, citing its recent rapid gains as the sole basis for their decision. The advisor has reason to believe this investment is not suitable for the client's stated long-term financial goals and moderate risk tolerance. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance and professional ethics for the Banorte advisor? Option A. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of financial products to determine if the cryptocurrency fund aligns with their profile. If not, explain the suitability concerns and propose alternative, compliant investment options that meet the client's overall financial goals. Option B. Immediately execute the client's requested investment in the cryptocurrency fund to demonstrate responsiveness and secure the business, assuming the client is fully aware of the risks involved. Option C. Agree to invest in the cryptocurrency fund, but include a disclaimer that the client assumes all responsibility for any potential losses, thereby mitigating Banorte's liability. Option D. Inform the client that Banorte does not offer investments in cryptocurrency funds and suggest they seek advice elsewhere for such specific needs. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of financial products to determine if the cryptocurrency fund aligns with their profile. If not, explain the suitability concerns and propose alternative compliant investment options that meet the client's overall financial goals. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific investment strategy and the Banorte advisor's obligation to adhere to regulatory requirements and act in the client's best interest. The advisor must navigate the client's expectations while ensuring compliance with Mexican financial regulations, specifically those governing investment advice and suitability. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge of financial products. This aligns with the principles of Know Your Customer, KIC, and suitability requirements mandated by Mexican financial authorities. By prioritizing a comprehensive understanding of the client, The advisor can then recommend products and strategies that are appropriate and compliant, even if they differ from the client's initial, potentially uninformed, request. This upholds the advisor's fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations to protect the client. An incorrect approach would be to immediately implement the client's requested strategy without proper due diligence. This fails to meet the suitability requirements, as it bypasses the essential step of assessing whether the proposed investment aligns with the client's profile. Such an action could expose both the client and Banorte to undue risk and potential regulatory sanctions for noncompliance. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without explanation. While the request may be unsuitable, a professional advisor should explain the reasoning behind their recommendations, fostering transparency and client trust, rather than simply refusing. Finally, agreeing to the client's request solely to secure business, without regard for suitability, represents a severe ethical and regulatory breach, prioritizing commercial gain over client protection. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with understanding the client's needs and circumstances. This is followed by an assessment of regulatory requirements and internal policies. Only then should potential solutions be identified and recommended, with clear communication to the client regarding the rationale and associated risks. In situations of conflict, the advisor must prioritize regulatory compliance and the client's best interests, even if it means deviating from the client's initial preference, while providing clear and reasoned explanations. Question 6. The control framework reveals that a Banorte financial advisor has a close personal relationship with a prospective client who is seeking significant investment advice. The advisor is aware that managing this client's portfolio could lead to substantial personal bonuses. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Banorte financial advisor to ensure compliance with regulatory requirements and ethical standards? Option A. Proceed with managing the client's account, exercising extra diligence to ensure fair treatment and avoid any perceived favoritism. Option B. Inform the prospective client of the personal relationship and ask them if they are comfortable proceeding with the advisor. Option C. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to Banorte's compliance department and follow their guidance on managing the client relationship. Option D. Manage the client's account but avoid discussing personal matters with the client to maintain professional distance. Correct answer is C. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to Banorte's compliance department and follow their guidance on managing the client relationship. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an employee of Banorte to navigate a potential conflict of interest while adhering to internal policies and external regulations governing financial institutions in Mexico. The core difficulty lies in balancing personal relationships with professional obligations and ensuring that client interests are always prioritized over personal gain or favoritism. A robust control framework is designed to prevent such conflicts from compromising the integrity of Banorte's operations and client trust. The correct approach involves immediate and transparent disclosure of the relationship to the appropriate Banorte compliance department. This allows the company to assess the situation, implement necessary controls, such as reassigning the client or ensuring strict oversight, and uphold its fiduciary duty to the client. This aligns with regulatory expectations in Mexico that financial institutions must have strong internal controls to manage conflicts of interest and protect client assets and information. Ethical principles also dictate that employees must act in the best interest of their clients and the institution, avoiding situations that could impair their judgment or create an appearance of impropriety. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with managing the client's account without disclosure. This failure to disclose a material relationship creates a significant conflict of interest. Ethically, it breaches the duty of loyalty to Banorte and its clients. Regulationally, it violates Mexican financial regulations that mandate transparency and the management of conflicts of interest to prevent market abuse and protect consumers. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to manage the situation informally by simply being extra careful. While well-intentioned, this bypasses the established compliance procedures and leaves the situation vulnerable to unconscious bias or perceived favoritism, which can still lead to regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage for Banorte. It fails to provide the necessary oversight and documentation that regulatory bodies expect. Professionals at Banorte should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency and adherence to establish compliance protocols. When faced with a potential conflict of interest, the first step is to identify the conflict. The next step is to consult the relevant internal policies and procedures, which in this case would direct the employee to report the relationship. If there is any doubt, seeking guidance from the compliance department is crucial. This proactive and documented approach ensures that the institution's interests and client trust are protected, while also safeguarding the employee from potential disciplinary action. Question 7. Investigation of a Banorte client's recent large cash deposit, which deviates significantly from their usual transaction patterns, and for which the client provides a verbal explanation that, while plausible, does not fully align with supporting documentation, requires a specific course of action to ensure compliance with regulatory frameworks. Which of the following represents the most appropriate response for a Banorte employee in this situation? Option A. Immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant Mexican Financial Intelligence Unit based on the initial red flags. Option B. Accept the client's explanation and close the matter without further internal reporting, as the client provided a reason for the transaction. Option C. Escalate the transaction and the client's explanation through Banorte's internal suspicious activity reporting procedures for further review by the compliance department. Option D. Discuss the potential reporting of the transaction with the client to understand their concerns before making a decision. The correct answer is A. Immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant Mexican Financial Intelligence Unit based on the initial red flags. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and the regulatory obligations of Banorte. The core difficulty lies in balancing client satisfaction with the imperative to adhere to anti-money laundering (AML) regulations, specifically those concerning the reporting of suspicious transactions. A failure to correctly identify and report suspicious activity can lead to severe penalties for Banorte, including fines, reputational damage, and potential loss of operating licenses. Conversely, incorrectly flagging a legitimate transaction can harm client relationships and potentially lead to unnecessary investigations. The correct approach involves a thorough, objective assessment of the client's transaction patterns and the information available, guided by Banorte's internal AML policies and relevant Mexican financial regulations. This approach prioritizes regulatory compliance by initiating the internal reporting process for suspicious activity, even when the client provides a plausible explanation. The justification for this lies in the principle that internal reporting mechanisms are designed to allow for further investigation by designated compliance personnel, who are equipped to assess the totality of the circumstances and determine the appropriate course of action, including filing a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant authorities if warranted. This aligns with the spirit and letter of AML laws that mandate vigilance and reporting. An incorrect approach would be to accept the client's explanation at face value and dismiss the transaction as non-suspicious without further internal review. This fails to acknowledge the potential for sophisticated money laundering schemes, where explanations are deliberately crafted to mislead. Ethically and regulatorily, this approach abdicates the responsibility to investigate potential illicit financial flows. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately file a SAR without conducting any internal due diligence or attempting to gather additional information from the client or internal records. While proactive reporting is important, an unsubstantiated SAR can be detrimental and may indicate a lack of proper risk assessment and internal controls. Finally, an approach that involves discussing the potential SAR with the client before reporting would be a severe breach of confidentiality and could facilitate further illicit activity, constituting a direct violation of AML regulations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's profile and transaction history. When a transaction deviates from established patterns or raises red flags, the immediate step is to consult Banorte's internal AML policies and procedures. This involves documenting the observed red flags and the client's explanation. If the explanation does not fully alleviate the suspicion, the next step is to escalate the matter through the designated internal reporting channels for suspicious activity. This ensures that the decision to report or not report is made by a specialized compliance team with access to broader information and expertise, thereby upholding regulatory obligations and protecting Banorte. Question 8. Operational review demonstrates that Banorte is exploring innovative ways to leverage customer data to personalize financial product offerings and enhance customer service interactions. A proposal has been put forth to use aggregated customer transaction data, anonymized where possible, to identify emerging trends and proactively suggest relevant banking solutions. However, the proposal does not explicitly detail how customer consent for this specific type of data utilization, beyond the initial account opening, will be obtained or verified, nor does it clearly outline the legal basis under Mexican law for such processing if anonymization is not fully effective. What is the most appropriate regulatory compliance approach for Banorte to adopt in this situation? Option A. Initiate a comprehensive review of the proposed data utilization strategy against the Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de los Particulares, LFPDPPP, and its regulations, focusing on the legal basis for processing, the adequacy of consent mechanisms for any non-anonymized data, and the accuracy of privacy notices. Option B. Delegate the responsibility for ensuring compliance to the IT department, trusting their technical expertise to implement appropriate data security and privacy measures without direct legal or compliance oversight. Option C. Implement the data utilization strategy immediately, relying on the general terms and conditions agreed upon at account opening, which broadly cover data usage for service improvement. Option D. Proceed with the data utilization strategy after conducting a thorough anonymization of the data, assuming that anonymized data falls outside the scope of personal data protection regulations. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the data utilization strategy after conducting a thorough anonymization of the data, assuming that anonymized data falls outside the scope of personal data protection regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a business objective, enhancing customer experience through data utilization, and the stringent data privacy regulations applicable to financial institutions like Banorte. The core difficulty lies in balancing innovation with compliance, ensuring that any data-driven initiative strictly adheres to legal mandates and ethical considerations. Careful judgment is required to navigate this delicate balance, preventing potential regulatory breaches and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough assessment of the proposed data utilization strategy against Banorte's obligations under Mexican data protection laws, specifically the Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de los Particulares, LFPDPPP, and its accompanying regulations. This includes identifying the types of personal data involved, the purpose of processing, the legal basis for such processing, e.g., consent, legitimate interest, and ensuring appropriate security measures are in place. The correct approach prioritizes obtaining explicit and informed consent from customers for any new data uses that go beyond the original purpose for which the data was collected, or ensuring a clear legal basis exists. It also mandates a review of Banorte's privacy notices to ensure they accurately reflect the proposed data processing activities and are easily accessible to customers. This aligns with the LFPDPPP principles of legality, proportionality, purpose limitation, and consent, safeguarding customer rights and ensuring Banorte operates within the legal framework. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential business benefits without a comprehensive legal review would fail to uphold Banorte's regulatory obligations. This could lead to violations of the LFPDPPP, resulting in significant fines, legal action, and severe damage to customer trust and Banorte's reputation. Another incorrect approach that assumes existing consent is sufficient for all new data uses, without verifying the scope and specificity of that consent, is also a critical failure. The LFPDPPP requires consent to be informed and specific to the processing activity. Furthermore, an approach that bypasses the internal legal and compliance departments, attempting to implement the strategy without their oversight, demonstrates a disregard for established internal controls and regulatory adherence, creating a significant compliance risk. Professionals at Banorte should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the regulatory landscape relevant to the proposed action. This involves consulting with legal and compliance experts to understand specific obligations under Mexican law. The next step is to assess the proposed business activity against these regulations, identifying any potential conflicts or areas requiring specific compliance measures. This includes evaluating the data involved, the the processing activities, and the legal basis for each. If the proposed activity requires customer consent, the process for obtaining clear, informed, and specific consent must be established and rigorously followed. Finally, ongoing monitoring and review are crucial to ensure continued compliance as regulations and business practices evolve. Question 9. System analysis indicates that a Banorte client has reported an issue requiring input from both the retail banking and investment services departments. To facilitate a swift resolution, an employee has access to the client's full name, account number, and a summary of their investment portfolio. Which of the following actions best aligns with Banorte's regulatory obligations regarding client data privacy and confidentiality? Option A. Transmit the client's full name, account number, and a detailed summary of their investment portfolio via an encrypted internal messaging system to a designated contact in the investment services department, after verifying their identity and role. Option B. Send an email containing the client's full name, account number, and a detailed summary of their investment portfolio to a colleague in the investment services department, assuming they are trustworthy. Option C. Share the client's full name, account number, and a detailed summary of their investment portfolio with an external IT support vendor who is assisting with a general system issue, without specific client consent for this disclosure. Option D. Discuss the client's situation and portfolio details verbally with a colleague from the investment services department in a busy cafeteria area within the Banorte branch. The correct answer is A. Transmit the client's full name, account number, and a detailed summary of their investment portfolio via an encrypted internal messaging system to a designated contact in the investment services department, after verifying their identity and role. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Banorte regarding the handling of sensitive client information. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for internal collaboration to resolve a client issue with the strict regulatory requirements for data privacy and confidentiality. Misjudging the appropriate channels or methods for sharing information can lead to significant breaches of trust and regulatory penalties for Banorte. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves adhering strictly to Banorte's internal policies and relevant Mexican financial regulations concerning data protection and client confidentiality. This means utilizing secure, authorized channels for information sharing, such as encrypted internal communication systems or anonymized data summaries, and ensuring that any information shared is strictly necessary for the resolution of the client's issue and is only disclosed to authorized personnel within Banorte who have a legitimate need to know. This approach upholds the principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, which are fundamental to regulatory compliance and client trust. Incorrect approach is analysis. Sharing the client's full account details via an unencrypted email to a colleague in another department, even with the intention of resolving an issue, represents a significant regulatory failure. This method lacks the security protocols mandated by data protection laws, exposing sensitive client information to potential interception and unauthorized access. It violates the principle of confidentiality and could lead to penalties under Mexican data protection laws. Forwarding the client's personal identification documents to an external vendor without explicit client consent and without a clear, documented business need and contractual agreement for data processing is another regulatory failure. This action bypasses established procedures for third-party data sharing, which typically require robust due diligence, data processing agreements, and explicit consent, thereby breaching client privacy and potentially violating data protection regulations. Discussing the client's financial situation in a public area of the Banorte office, even with another Banorte employee, is an ethical and regulatory lapse. This creates an unnecessary risk of information being overheard by unauthorized individuals, compromising client confidentiality and potentially violating internal policies designed to prevent such breaches. Professional reasoning. Professionals at Banorte should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and client confidentiality. This involves 1. Identifying the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the situation, e.g., data protection laws in Mexico, Banorte's internal policies. 2. Assessing the sensitivity of the information involved. 3. Determining the minimum necessary information required to achieve the legitimate business objective. 4. selecting the most secure and authorized communication channel or method for sharing information. 5. Documenting the process and obtaining necessary approvals or consents. When in doubt, seeking guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel is paramount. Question 10. When evaluating a new investment proposal from a long-standing client of Banorte, who specifically requests a high-risk, speculative instrument that appears to fall outside their established risk profile and financial capacity, what is the most appropriate course of action for a Banorte employee to take? Option A. Conduct a thorough suitability assessment to determine if the proposed investment aligns with the client's financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance, and if not, explain the regulatory and suitability concerns before offering alternative appropriate solutions. Option B. Decline the investment outright and inform the client that Banorte does not offer such products. Option C. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, assuming their judgment is sound given their history with Banorte. Option D. Recommend a slightly less risky but still speculative product to accommodate the client's desire for high returns, even if it still exceeds their assessed risk tolerance. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, assuming their judgment is sound given their history with Banorte. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the regulatory obligations of Banorte. A financial advisor must navigate this tension while upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to Mexican financial regulations. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that client interests are paramount, even when those interests might be misaligned with prudent financial advice or regulatory mandates. The correct approach involves prioritizing Banorte's regulatory compliance and the client's best interests as defined by applicable Mexican financial laws and internal policies. This means conducting a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, and then recommending products that genuinely align with these factors, even if they differ from the client's initial, potentially ill-informed request. This approach is justified by the principles of investor protection enshrined in Mexican financial regulations, which mandate that financial institutions act with diligence, transparency, and in the best interest of their clients. It also aligns with Banorte's ethical obligations to provide sound financial advice. An incorrect approach would be to solely accede to the client's request without due diligence. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement of suitability, which mandates that investments recommended must be appropriate for the client's circumstances. Another incorrect approach would be to push a product that, while technically meeting the client's stated desire, carries hidden risks or fees that are not fully disclosed or are disproportionate to the potential benefits, violating principles of transparency and fair dealing. Finally, an approach that prioritizes Banorte's sales targets over the client's well-being would be a clear breach of regulatory and ethical standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of client needs and regulatory requirements. This involves active listening, thorough fact-finding, and a critical evaluation of product suitability against client profiles. When a client's request conflicts with regulatory obligations or best practices, the professional must clearly explain the rationale for alternative recommendations, focusing on the client's long-term financial health and adherence to legal frameworks. Transparency and client education are key to resolving such conflicts constructively. Question 11. Operational review demonstrates that a long-standing and high-value client of Banorte is hesitant to provide updated identification and source of funds documentation, citing inconvenience and a desire to maintain privacy. The client has explicitly stated that if these requirements are strictly enforced, they may consider moving their business elsewhere. The Banorte relationship manager is under pressure to retain this client's assets. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Banorte relationship manager? Option A. Immediately terminate the client relationship due to non-compliance with documentation requirements. Option B. Inform the client that while the documentation is preferred, it is not strictly necessary for clients with a long history and substantial assets with Banorte. Option C. Proceed with the client's transactions without the updated documentation to avoid losing their business, assuming the client has been with Banorte for a significant period. Option D. Politely but firmly explain to the client that the requested documentation is a mandatory regulatory requirement for all clients, as per Mexican financial regulations and Banorte's internal policies, and offer assistance in gathering the necessary information. The correct answer is D. Politely but firmly explain to the client that the requested documentation is a mandatory regulatory requirement for all clients, as per Mexican financial regulations and Banorte's internal policies, and offer assistance in gathering the necessary information. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a business objective, client retention, and regulatory obligations. The need for careful judgment arises from balancing the desire to maintain a valuable client relationship with the imperative to adhere to Banorte's internal policies and relevant Mexican financial regulations concerning customer due diligence and anti-money laundering. AML. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and internal policy adherence over immediate client satisfaction. This means clearly communicating to the client that the requested information is a mandatory requirement for ongoing business, explaining the regulatory basis without divulging confidential internal procedures, and offering assistance in gathering the necessary documentation. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant, as it upholds Banorte's responsibility to prevent financial crime and maintain robust Know Your Customer (KIC) procedures, as mandated by Mexican banking laws and CNBV, Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, regulations. An incorrect approach that involves waiving the required documentation for this specific client, despite the stated policy, would constitute a serious regulatory and ethical failure. This would violate AML and KYC regulations, potentially exposing Banorte to significant fines, reputational damage, and legal repercussions for failing to conduct adequate due diligence. It would also undermine the integrity of Banorte's internal control framework and set a dangerous precedent for other clients. Another incorrect approach, which is to proceed with the transaction without the client's full cooperation and without escalating the issue, demonstrates a lack of diligence and a disregard for established procedures. This could lead to the facilitation of illicit activities, directly contravening the spirit and letter of financial crime prevention laws. A third incorrect approach, which is to immediately terminate the relationship without attempting to educate the client or offer support, while compliant, may not be the most professionally nuanced. While regulatory adherence is paramount, a more constructive approach involves clear communication and assistance, which can sometimes resolve the issue without resorting to immediate termination, provided the client is willing to cooperate. The professional decision-making process in such situations should involve 1. Identifying the conflict between business goals and regulatory requirements. 2. Consulting internal policies and relevant regulations to understand the non-negotiable aspects. 3. Communicating clearly and professionally with the client, explaining the necessity of the requirements. 4. Offering support and guidance to facilitate compliance. 5. Escalating the matter internally if the client remains unwilling or unable to comply, to determine the appropriate course of action as per Banorte's established protocols and regulatory guidance. Question 12. Analysis of how an employee at Banorte should proceed when a client expresses interest in an investment product that offers a significantly higher commission to the employee compared to other suitable alternatives. Option A. Suggest the investment product with the highest commission, but briefly mention that other options exist without detailing their features or suitability. Option B. Focus the discussion primarily on the investment product with the highest commission, highlighting its potential returns while downplaying any associated risks or complexities. Option C. Conduct a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives, and then present all suitable product options, including those with lower commissions, explaining the pros and cons of each before making a recommendation that best serves the client's interests. Option D. Recommend the investment product that offers the highest commission, emphasizing its potential benefits to the client. Correct answer is D. Recommend the investment product that offers the highest commission, emphasizing its potential benefits to the client. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Banorte due to the inherent conflict between client interests and potential personal gain, requiring careful judgment to uphold regulatory compliance and ethical standards. Core difficulty lies in navigating situations where a client's financial needs might align with a product that offers a higher commission to the employee, necessitating a robust framework to prevent mis-selling or undue influence. The correct approach involves prioritizing the client's best interests above all else, ensuring that any recommendation made by Banorte employees is suitable for the client's specific circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial objectives. This aligns with the fundamental principles of financial advisory conduct, which mandate that clients' needs are paramount. Specifically, regulatory frameworks governing financial institutions in Mexico, such as those overseen by the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, CNBV, emphasize suitability and fiduciary duties. Employees must act with integrity and diligence, providing clear, accurate, and unbiased information about all available products, including their risks and benefits, and ensuring that the chosen product genuinely serves the client's goals, not just the employee's commission. An incorrect approach would be to steer the client towards a product solely because it offers a higher commission, without a thorough assessment of its suitability. This constitutes a breach of ethical conduct and potentially violates CNBV regulations regarding client protection and fair dealing. Such an action prioritizes personal gain over client welfare, undermining trust and the reputation of Banorte. Another incorrect approach is to downplay the risks or complexities of a higher commission product to make it appear more attractive. This misrepresentation is a serious ethical and regulatory failure, as it prevents the client from making an informed decision. It violates the principle of transparency and can lead to significant financial harm for the client, exposing both the employee and Banorte to regulatory sanctions and legal liabilities. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to avoid discussing alternative products that might be more suitable but offer lower commissions. This failure to provide a comprehensive range of options, driven by self-interest, is a violation of the duty to act in the client's best interest and to offer a fair and balanced selection of financial solutions. The professional reasoning process for similar situation should involve a clear hierarchy of priorities. First, understanding the client's needs and financial situation. Second, identifying all suitable product options that meet those needs. Third, transparently presenting all options, including their respective risks, benefits, and associated costs, including commissions. And finally, recommending the product that best aligns with the client's objectives, regardless of the commission structure. This systematic process, grounded in regulatory requirements and ethical principles, ensures that decisions are client-centric and compliant. Question 13. The efficiency study reveals that Banorte could significantly improve its customer service response times by analyzing detailed customer transaction histories. To facilitate this analysis, a proposal has been made to share raw, unanonymized transaction data with an external consulting firm specializing in operational efficiency. What is the most appropriate course of action for Banorte, considering the regulatory framework governing data protection in Mexico? Option A. Postpone the efficiency study until a new, more comprehensive data privacy policy can be developed and approved by the board of directors. Option B. Share the raw transaction data with the external consultants, relying on their confidentiality agreement to protect customer privacy, as the efficiency gains are substantial. Option C. Implement a strict data anonymization process for all transaction data shared with the external consultants, ensuring no personally identifiable information is disclosed, in compliance with the Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de los Particulares. Option D. Obtain explicit, informed consent from each customer whose transaction data will be analyzed by the external consultants before sharing any information. The correct answer is C. Implement a strict data anonymization process for all transaction data shared with the external consultants, ensuring no personally identifiable information is disclosed, in compliance with the Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de los Particulares. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires Banorte employees to navigate the delicate balance between operational efficiency and strict adherence to regulatory mandates concerning customer data privacy and security. The pressure to streamline processes can inadvertently lead to shortcuts that compromise compliance, potentially resulting in significant financial penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. Careful judgment is paramount to ensure that efficiency gains do not come at the expense of legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves implementing a robust data anonymization protocol that meets the standards set by Mexican data protection laws, such as the Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de los Particulares, LFP-DPPP. This protocol should ensure that any data used for efficiency studies is rendered non-identifiable, preventing the disclosure of personal information. This aligns with the LFPD-PPP principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and security, safeguarding customer privacy while allowing for valuable operational analysis. An approach that involves sharing raw customer transaction data with external consultants without adequate anonymization or consent mechanisms fails to comply with the LFPD-PPP. This constitutes a direct violation of the law's provisions on data transfer and processing, exposing Banorte to severe penalties. Another incorrect approach, which is to rely solely on the consultant's assurances of confidentiality without verifying their data handling practices against LFPD-PPP requirements, is also professionally unacceptable. While confidentiality agreements are important, they do not absolve Banorte of its primary responsibility to ensure compliance with Mexican data protection regulations. The burden of proof for compliant data handling rests with Banorte. Finally, an approach that involves delaying the efficiency study until a comprehensive new data privacy policy can be drafted and implemented, while well-intentioned, may not be the most practical or efficient solution if existing regulations already provide a clear framework for handling such data. The focus should be on applying existing, compliant methods rather than creating unnecessary delays. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Identifying the specific regulations applicable to the situation, in this case, LFPD-PPP. 2. Assessing the proposed action against these regulations, considering data privacy, security, and consent requirements. 3. Seeking legal and compliance department guidance when in doubt. 4. Prioritizing solutions that demonstrably meet regulatory standards, even if they require more initial effort. 5. Documenting all decisions and justifications to demonstrate due diligence. Question 14. Stakeholder feedback indicates that some Banorte clients are frustrated by the perceived difficulty in accessing consolidated financial advice across different product lines within the bank. A new internal initiative proposes a more integrated approach where client relationship managers can access a broader view of a client's holdings and interactions across various Banorte divisions to offer more holistic advice. However, concerns have been raised about the potential for unauthorized access or sharing of sensitive client data between these divisions without explicit client consent. What is the most appropriate course of action for Banorte to implement this integrated client advisory initiative while ensuring strict adherence to regulatory requirements concerning client data privacy? Option A. Implement the initiative by allowing relationship managers access to all client data across divisions, relying on existing internal data sharing agreements, and assuming client consent for comprehensive service. Option B. Proceed with the initiative by sharing client data on a need-to-know basis between divisions, with relationship managers making independent judgments about what information is relevant for advice. Option C. Develop a robust consent management system that requires explicit, informed client consent before any cross-divisional data sharing for advisory purposes, with clear opt-out mechanisms. Option D. Limit the initiative to only sharing anonymized or aggregated client data, which would not require individual client consent, but might limit the depth of personalized advice. The correct answer is A. Implement the initiative by allowing relationship managers access to all client data across divisions, relying on existing internal data sharing agreements, and assuming client consent for comprehensive service. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client expectations and regulatory obligations. Banorte, as a financial institution, is bound by strict regulations regarding data privacy and the handling of client information. The challenge lies in balancing the desire to provide responsive customer service with the imperative to comply with these regulations, ensuring client trust and avoiding legal repercussions. Careful judgment is required to navigate this delicate balance. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance by seeking explicit client consent before sharing any personal information, even with internal departments. This upholds Banorte's commitment to data protection laws and builds client trust by demonstrating transparency and respect for their privacy. Specifically, this aligns with principles of data minimization and purpose limitation, ensuring that information is only used for the purposes for which it was collected, and with the individual's informed consent. An incorrect approach would be to share client information based on an assumption of implied consent or internal policy without explicit verification. This failure to obtain explicit consent directly violates data privacy regulations, which mandate clear and affirmative consent for data processing. Another incorrect approach would be to refuse to share any information, even when necessary for client service, without exploring compliant alternatives. This could lead to poor customer experience and potentially damage Banorte's reputation for service. A third incorrect approach would be to share information with a vague understanding of its use, neglecting to confirm the specific purpose and necessity, which also risks regulatory breach and misuse of data. Professionals at Banorte should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the regulatory requirements applicable to the situation. They must then assess the client's request against these requirements, prioritizing compliance. If a request appears to conflict with regulations, the next step is to explore compliant alternatives, such as obtaining explicit consent or anonymizing data where appropriate. Escalation to a compliance officer or legal counsel should be considered if the situation is complex or uncertain. The overarching principle is to always act in a manner that protects client data and adheres to all relevant laws and ethical standards. Question 15. Research into how a Banorte financial advisor should respond when a long-standing client, with a previously established conservative investment profile, requests to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, unregistered digital asset that is not typically offered by Banorte, citing a hot tip from a friend. Option A. Politely decline the transaction, explaining that the proposed investment does not align with the client's established risk profile and Banorte's approved product offerings, and offer to discuss alternative suitable investments. Option B. Seek out a third-party platform that offers the requested digital asset and facilitate the transaction through that channel to meet the client's demand. Option C. Immediately report the client to the relevant financial intelligence unit for suspected illicit activity without further discussion. Option D. Execute the transaction immediately as requested by the client to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential loss of business. The correct answer is D. Execute the transaction immediately as requested by the client to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential loss of business. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's explicit request and the regulatory obligations of Banorte. A financial advisor must navigate this tension while upholding their fiduciary duty and adhering to Mexican financial regulations, specifically those governing client suitability and the prevention of illicit activities. The core difficulty lies in balancing client autonomy with the imperative to protect both the client and the institution from potential harm or regulatory breaches. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of the client's stated investment objective against their documented risk profile and financial situation, as per Banorte's internal policies and relevant Mexican financial laws. This includes understanding the underlying reasons for the client's request and explaining the potential risks associated with the proposed investment, even if it deviates from their established profile. If, after this due diligence, the investment remains unsuitable or raises red flags regarding potential illicit activities, the advisor must politely but firmly decline the transaction, citing regulatory compliance and the best interests of the client. This upholds the principles of know your customer, KIC, and suitability, which are fundamental to responsible financial advisory practice in Mexico. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the transaction solely based on the client's insistence without conducting the necessary suitability checks. This directly violates the principle of acting in the client's best interest and could expose Banorte to significant regulatory penalties for failing to adhere to KYC and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. Another incorrect approach is to immediately report the client to authorities without first attempting to understand the client's intentions and explaining the regulatory constraints. While vigilance against illicit activities is crucial, a premature escalation without proper investigation can damage client relationships and may not be in line with the graduated response expected by regulators. Finally, attempting to find a loophole or a less regulated product to satisfy the client's request without proper due diligence on that alternative product also constitutes a failure, as it bypasses the spirit of regulatory compliance. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process. First, understand the client's request and underlying motivation. Second, consult relevant internal policies and external regulations, e.g., CNBV guidelines. Third, assess the request against the client's profile and risk tolerance. Fourth, communicate findings and potential risks clearly to the client. And fifth, if the request remains unsuitable or raises concerns, document the decision and politely decline, escalating internally if necessary. Question 16. Operational review demonstrates that a new client onboarding process at Banorte has a minor procedural deviation, or the verification of one specific supporting document is being inconsistently applied by a junior team member, potentially creating a gap in Know Your Customer (KIC) procedures. The team member believes this deviation is insignificant and will not impact the overall compliance of the onboarding. What is the most appropriate course of action for the reviewer? Option A. Immediately escalate the identified procedural deviation to the Banorte Compliance Department and the internal audit team for review and remediation. Option B. Instruct the junior team member to continue the current practice, but to be more diligent in ensuring the document is eventually obtained. Option C. Document the deviation in the review report but take no immediate action, assuming it will be addressed during a future, broader process review. Option D. Advise the junior team member to correct the deviation internally, without reporting it to avoid unnecessary administrative burden. The correct answer is A. Immediately escalate the identified procedural deviation to the Banorte Compliance Department and the internal audit team for review and remediation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between achieving business objectives and adhering to stringent regulatory requirements. The pressure to meet performance targets can sometimes lead individuals to overlook or rationalize minor deviations from established compliance procedures. However, in the financial services industry, particularly within a regulated entity like Banorte, maintaining the highest standards of regulatory compliance is paramount and non-negotiable. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent reporting of the identified control weakness. This demonstrates a commitment to regulatory integrity and internal control frameworks, specifically immediately escalating the issue to the compliance department and the relevant internal audit function, as per Banorte's established internal policies and procedures, aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory oversight. This ensures that the issue is addressed promptly by those responsible for remediation, and that the necessary reporting to regulatory bodies, if required, is initiated in a timely manner. This approach upholds the principle of Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations by ensuring that customer onboarding processes are robust and compliant. An incorrect approach would be to overlook the identified control gap, assuming it is a minor oversight that will not have significant consequences. This failure to report a known weakness directly violates regulatory expectations for robust internal controls and risk management. It can lead to severe penalties, reputational damage, and potential legal repercussions for Banorte. Another incorrect approach would be to attempt to rectify the control gap independently without involving the compliance department or internal audit. This bypasses established governance structures, prevents proper documentation of the issue and its resolution, and could lead to an incomplete or ineffective remediation, potentially masking a more systemic problem. Furthermore, it undermines the authority and role of the compliance function, which is critical for ensuring adherence to regulations. Professionals in such situations should employ a decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory adherence and ethical conduct above all else. This involves understanding the company's internal policies and procedures related to compliance and risk management, recognizing the potential impact of control weaknesses on regulatory compliance, and having the courage to escalate issues transparently and promptly to the appropriate internal stakeholders. A framework of report first, ask questions later, for potential compliance breaches is essential. Question 17. Comparative studies suggest that employees in financial institutions often encounter situations where personal relationships might intersect with professional duties. An employee at Banorte has a close personal friend who is a senior executive at a publicly traded company. This friend confides in the Banorte employee about an upcoming, significant merger that is not yet public knowledge and could substantially impact the stock price of their company. The The Banorte employee is considering discussing potential investment strategies with their friend based on this information, believing it could benefit both parties. Which of the following actions best aligns with regulatory compliance and ethical conduct for an employee at Banorte? Option A. Use the information to make personal investments through a different financial institution to avoid direct conflict with Banorte's internal systems. Option B. Proceed with discussing investment strategies with a friend, assuming the information is not yet material enough to constitute insider trading and that the personal relationship allows for a degree of discretion. Option C. Advise the friend that Banorte's policies prohibit discussing non-public information and politely end the conversation, without reporting the incident to Banorte's compliance department. Option D. Immediately report the conversation and the nature of the information to Banorte's compliance department, and refrain from any further discussion or action related to the merger until cleared by compliance. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the conversation and the nature of the information to Banorte's compliance department, and refrain from any further discussion or action related to the merger until cleared by compliance. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee at Banorte to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure adherence to internal policies and external regulations governing financial institutions in Mexico. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining client confidentiality and preventing the misuse of non-public information, while also fostering business relationships. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between legitimate business networking and activities that could compromise Banorte's integrity or violate regulatory standards. The correct approach involves a proactive and transparent communication strategy. This means promptly informing the compliance department at Banorte about the potential business relationship and any information that might be considered sensitive or non-public. This allows the compliance team to assess the situation against Banorte's internal conflict of interest policies and relevant Mexican financial regulations, such as those issued by the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, CNBV. By seeking guidance and approval, the employee ensures that any engagement is conducted within the established legal and ethical boundaries, safeguarding both the client's interests and Banorte's reputation. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the business relationship without disclosure, assuming the information shared is not material or that the relationship is purely social. This failure to disclose creates a significant regulatory and ethical risk. It could lead to violations of insider trading regulations if the shared information is deemed material non-public information, and it breaches Banorte's internal policies on conflict of interest and information handling. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on personal judgment about the sensitivity of the information. Financial institutions operate under strict regulatory oversight, and subjective interpretations of what constitutes confidential information can lead to serious compliance breaches. The regulatory framework demands a formal process for assessing such situations, not informal personal assessments. Professionals at Banorte should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency and adherence to established compliance procedures. When faced with a situation that could potentially involve a conflict of interest or the handling of sensitive information, the first step should always be to consult Banorte's internal policies and procedures. If there is any ambiguity or potential for a breach, the next step is to escalate the matter to the compliance department for guidance and approval. This proactive approach ensures that all actions are aligned with regulatory requirements and ethical standards, mitigating risks for both the individual and the institution. Question 18. Operational review demonstrates that Banorte is exploring innovative ways to personalize customer interactions and improve service delivery by analyzing customer data. However, the proposed methods involve utilizing a broad spectrum of customer information, including transaction history and communication logs, without explicit, granular consent for each specific analytical purpose. What is the most compliant and ethically sound approach for Banorte to proceed? Option A. Implement a robust data governance framework that includes obtaining explicit, informed consent from customers for each specific use of their data, coupled with advanced anonymization techniques for any data used in broader analytical initiatives where granular consent is not feasible. Option B. Proceed with analyzing all available customer data to enhance customer experience, assuming that the general terms and conditions agreed upon by customers implicitly grant permission for such data utilization. Option C. Utilize anonymized customer data for analytical purposes without seeking specific consent, as anonymization inherently removes personal identifiers and thus negates the need for consent under data protection regulations. Option D. Prioritize the business objective of improving customer experience by leveraging all customer data, and address any potential data privacy concerns reactively if regulatory bodies raise objections. The correct answer is A. Implement a robust data governance framework that includes obtaining explicit, informed consent from customers for each specific use of their data, coupled with advanced anonymization techniques for any data used in broader analytical initiatives where granular consent is not feasible. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a business objective, enhancing customer experience through data utilization, and the stringent regulatory requirements governing data privacy and security within the Mexican financial sector, as overseen by entities like the CNBV, Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores, and the IFT Instituto Federal de Telecomunicaciones for data protection aspects. Banorte, as a financial institution, must navigate these regulations meticulously to avoid severe penalties, reputational damage, and loss of customer trust. The core of the challenge lies in balancing innovation with compliance. The correct approach involves a comprehensive data governance framework that prioritizes customer consent and data anonymization. This means implementing robust processes for obtaining explicit consent for data usage, clearly outlining how data will be used, and employing anonymization techniques to de-identify personal information before it is used for analytical purposes. This aligns with the principles of data protection enshrined in Mexican law, such as the Ley Federal de Protección de Datos Personales en Posesión de las Particulares, LFPDPPP, which mandates consent and purpose limitation. By focusing on anonymized data and explicit consent, Banorte upholds its legal obligations and ethical responsibilities, ensuring customer privacy is respected while still enabling valuable insights. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on leveraging all available customer data without explicit consent for enhanced customer experience is a direct violation of data privacy laws. This failure to obtain consent is a fundamental breach of the LFPDPPP and related regulations, exposing Banorte to significant legal repercussions. Another incorrect approach, which involves using anonymized data but without a clear, documented internal policy on data handling and security, creates operational risks. While anonymization is a positive step, the absence of a robust governance framework means potential vulnerabilities in data handling and storage could still lead to breaches or misuse, even if the data is not directly identifiable. A third incorrect approach, which prioritizes business objectives over any data privacy considerations, represents a complete disregard for regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This would likely result in severe penalties, including substantial fines and potential operational restrictions, and would irrevocably damage Banorte's reputation. Professionals at Banorte should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant Mexican data protection laws and financial regulations. This involves proactive engagement with legal and compliance departments to interpret these regulations in the context of proposed business initiatives. Before any data is utilized, a risk assessment should be conducted to identify potential privacy and security concerns. Subsequently, a strategy should be developed that incorporates data minimization, anonymization, and crucially, the acquisition of explicit, informed consent from customers. Regular audits and reviews of data handling practices are essential to ensure ongoing compliance and to adapt to evolving regulatory landscapes. Question 19. Regulatory review indicates that a Banorte client, known for consistent, low-value transactions, has recently engaged in a series of unusually large cash deposits over a short period, with no clear economic justification provided by the client. As a Banorte employee, what is the most appropriate immediate action to take regarding this activity? Option A. Inform the client directly about the unusual nature of their deposits and inquire about the source of funds before reporting anything. Option B. Immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant authorities based on the deviation from the client's usual transaction patterns. Option C. Conduct a preliminary internal review of the client's transaction history and consult with Banorte's compliance department to assess the situation before taking further action. Option D. Continue to monitor the client's transactions without taking any immediate action, as definitive proof of illegal activity is not yet established. The correct answer is B. Immediately file a suspicious activity report (SAR) with the relevant authorities based on the deviation from the client's usual transaction patterns. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between client confidentiality and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities. A Banorte employee must exercise careful judgment to balance these competing interests, ensuring compliance with anti-money laundering (AML) regulations without unnecessarily breaching client trust. The core difficulty lies in identifying the threshold for suspicion and understanding the scope of reporting obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough internal review and consultation with Banorte's compliance department before filing a suspicious activity report (SAR). This is justified by regulatory frameworks that mandate financial institutions to establish robust AML programs, including procedures for identifying and reporting suspicious transactions. Specifically, Mexican AML laws and Banorte's internal policies require employees to escalate potential red flags to designated compliance officers. These officers are trained to assess the risk, gather necessary information, and determine if a SAR is warranted, thereby ensuring that reporting is based on reasonable suspicion and adheres to legal requirements, protecting both the institution and its clients from illicit activities. An incorrect approach of immediately filing a SAR without internal consultation fails to adhere to Banorte's established internal procedures and may lead to unnecessary reporting, potentially harming client relationships and wasting regulatory resources. This bypasses the crucial risk assessment and verification steps managed by the compliance department. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the transaction due to a lack of definitive proof of illegal activity is a direct violation of AML obligations. Regulations require reporting based on *suspicion*, not absolute certainty. Failing to report a transaction that raises reasonable suspicion exposes Banorte to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. A third incorrect approach of discussing the suspicious transaction with the client before reporting would constitute a breach of client confidentiality and potentially tip off the client, hindering any investigation. This is a serious regulatory and ethical failure, as it undermines the integrity of the AML framework. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes adherence to internal policies and regulatory guidelines. This involves 1. Recognizing potential red flags, 2. Documenting observations and concerns, 3. Escalating the matter to the designated compliance officer or department, 4. Cooperating fully with the compliance team's investigation and decision-making process, 5. Understanding that the ultimate decision to file a SAR rests with the compliance function, based on their assessment of the evidence and regulatory requirements. Question 20. Consider a scenario where a long-standing and high-value client of Banorte approaches their relationship manager with a request to transfer a substantial sum of funds to an overseas account that is known to be in a jurisdiction with weak anti-money laundering controls. The client is insistent and expresses frustration when the relationship manager hesitates, stating that they have always been accommodated in the past. The relationship manager is aware that this type of transaction, while not explicitly illegal for the client, raises significant red flags according to Banorte's internal risk assessment policies and general AML/CTF guidelines applicable in Mexico. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Banorte relationship manager? Option A. Attempt to find a way to structure the transfer through a third-party intermediary or a series of smaller transactions to circumvent the direct red flags associated with the destination country. Option B. Inform the client that the request cannot be processed and immediately escalate the matter to senior management without providing any further explanation or offering alternatives. Option C. Politely decline the client's request, citing Banorte's internal policies and regulatory obligations regarding international transfers and risk mitigation, and offer to explore alternative compliant methods if available. Option D. Proceed with the transfer as requested by the client to maintain the relationship and avoid client dissatisfaction, assuming the client's past transactions were legitimate. The correct answer is C. Politely decline the client's request, citing Banorte's internal policies and regulatory obligations regarding international transfers and risk mitigation, and offer to explore alternative, compliant methods if available. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Banorte due to the inherent conflict between a client's request and the bank's internal policies, designed to protect both the client and the institution from financial crime. The need for careful judgment arises from balancing client service with the imperative of regulatory compliance and risk mitigation. The correct approach involves politely but firmly declining the client's request, explaining that Banorte's policies, aligned with Mexican financial regulations such as those issued by the Comisión Nacional Bancaria y de Valores (CNBV) and the Financial Intelligence Unit (UIF), prohibit such transactions to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. This approach upholds Banorte's commitment to regulatory compliance, demonstrates ethical conduct by prioritizing risk management over immediate client satisfaction, and protects the bank from potential legal repercussions and reputational damage. It also educates the client on the bank's operational boundaries and the importance of regulatory frameworks. An incorrect approach of accepting the transaction without further scrutiny would be a severe regulatory and ethical failure. It would directly violate anti-money laundering (AML) and counter-terrorist financing (CTF) regulations, exposing Banorte to significant fines, sanctions, and loss of operating licenses. Ethically, it would demonstrate a disregard for the bank's responsibility to prevent illicit financial activities. Another incorrect approach of attempting to find a loophole or a less direct method to fulfill the request is equally problematic. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a willingness to circumvent established compliance procedures, which is a serious ethical breach and could still lead to regulatory violations if discovered. Finally, an approach of simply deferring the decision without providing a clear rationale or resolution fails to address the core compliance issue and leaves the client in an uncertain position, while also not fulfilling the employee's duty to act in accordance with Banorte's policies and regulatory requirements. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding and adhering to internal policies and external regulations. When faced with a client request that appears to conflict with these, the first step is to clearly identify the potential regulatory or policy violation. Next, consult relevant internal guidelines and, if necessary, seek clarification from compliance or legal departments. The decision should then be made based on a strict interpretation of these rules, communicating the outcome clearly and professionally to the client, while always maintaining a helpful and respectful demeanor.